This is Citations Needed with Nima Shirazi and Adam Johnson.
Welcome to Citations Needed, a podcast on the media, power, PR, and the history of bullshit. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
You can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed, and become a supporter of the show through patreon.com/CitationsNeededPodcast. All your support through Patreon is so incredibly appreciated, as we are 100% listener funded and do not run any commercials or ads, and that is really a testament to all of our amazing supporters who are able to keep the show going without any of that nonsense. So please do become a supporter of our work if you care to, if you are able to. It is so appreciated.
With the exception of one ad, which is a ad I run for my wife. My wife, Sarah Lazar, and contributor to the show, has a book coming out, which I'm now shamelessly using my podcast to promote. It is a regulatory noir that takes place in 2002 about the corporate capture of utilities in Springfield, Illinois. It's brisk, it's funny, I think it's a good read, and it has to do with the very sexy topic of public ownership of utilities. The title is Testimony. It's written by Sarah Lazar and her late father, Peter Lazar. He wrote the first draft. After he passed, she finished it. It is published by Strong Arm Press. You can find it at Strong Arm Press, or you can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble and search for it there. Unfortunately, those are the only sites you can buy it at because it's a small publisher, so it doesn't really scale to sell it any other way. If you could please order it there, we'd be very grateful. It came out on July 20th, so it's new, it's fresh, it's hip. All the kids are doing it. Check out Testimony by Sarah Lazar and Peter Lazar. Thank you so much for listening to this shameless plug of my wife's book.
That will do it for this shameless promotion, a family affair on Citations Needed. Please do buy the book. It came out officially July 20th, so it is available. Go get it, folks. America's 50 best cities to live in, reveals USA Today. These rising U.S. cities could become the top places to live and work from home, reports CNBC. The best U.S. cities to raise a family, lists MarketWatch.
Over and over again in American media, we hear stories centered around ranking, judging, and analyzing the rather vague concept of a city. But who is being discussed when we talk about quote-unquote cities? How are cities a meaningful unit to understand a given space, especially in a country marked by runaway inequality and segregation?
When we're told Johns Creek, Georgia is the best city for young people, or Carmel, Indiana is the most livable, whose lives and experiences are the media really talking about? Who is the audience for these reports about the best cities for families, for nightlife, for safety, for education, for happiness?
The criteria most U.S. corporate media uses centers a very particular constituent. Your average homeowner or prospective homeowner, usually white, upwardly mobile, namely those who marketers, investors, and real estate agents most want to reach.
Cities, then, aren't deemed livable for their fair labor practices, but for their business-friendly policies. They're not worth moving to for their abundance of free public space in low-income neighborhoods, but for their charming boutiques and chic restaurants. They don't generally rank high for their strong rent control laws, but for their ability to attract tech companies, and they capture attention not for their excellent mental health statistics, but for their booming economies.
On this episode, we'll parse the ways in which media coverage of cities and urban living, often crafted by white professional class writers for white professional class audiences, and funded by faceless parent companies and corporate advertisers, centers the most powerful while ignoring the needs of the working class, the homeless, people with disabilities, and the vast majority of Black and brown residents.
Later on the show, we'll speak with Jawanza James Williams, Director of Organizing at Vocal New York, a statewide grassroots membership organization that builds power among low-income people directly impacted by HIV/AIDS, the drug war, mass incarceration, and homelessness.
One of the things that I think is critical for us to understand when we're thinking about the stories that we tell, the situations that we are describing, and the kind of city that we live in, and the kind of city that we imagine living in, that we understand that whiteness is central, that capital and the market is central. And so therefore, anybody that challenges the sort of centrality of whiteness, anyone that challenges the usefulness of a market system or the justification for it, those folks are left out of the conversation.
So when we were discussing this, the initial impetus for this episode was we were basically having a conversation where you say, whenever you talk to people, you talk about the concept of cities, like what are the best cities? I enjoyed living in this city. This city is this city is that. Mm-hmm. Chicago is great for this, or New York's too pretentious. Again, I know it can sound a little bit dorm room, but I remember thinking like, it's such a bizarre like conversation because it's like we don't make generalizations about states or any other kind of constituent. There are obviously certain threads that hold cities together, but it got us thinking, like, what is a city? How do you define a city? What is the metric of a city? Something that's, city planners and civil engineers and philosophers and literary types have poured over for centuries. Like, how do you define a city in any meaningful sense? And, it got me thinking that, like, this is not just an academic question, that this is actually a major driver of how public policymakers, to sort of establish the stakes here, how certain public policymakers on a city level, they very much want, and many of them openly advertise their desire to be featured highly on the best cities lists, specifically those done by USA Today and CNN, and that this is considered a victory for any particular municipality. And then, of course, what follows from that is, well, what's the criteria and who does the criteria serve? Because, Nima, a lot of people you talk to, like the most boring people in the world, and you say, like, what do you think about X city? The most boring people in the world, what's the first thing they mention? They mention restaurants.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to dunk on foodies because we'll do that for a separate episode. And I'm being pretty ungenerous here. But, like, if you're ever talking to someone, it's like, oh, what do you think about Portland? Oh, they have great restaurant. You walk away. Because, like, that's just, like, the least interesting thing you could possibly say about a city. Unless you, like, work in the industry, I suppose, right? Then it sort of seems relevant. But this is not unique. This is, like, when you look at best cities lists, as we'll obviously detail in this episode, things like nightlife, restaurants, and other things that are these are all fine. Having nice restaurants is good and all, but these are the things that are centered in that conversation. And you expand it further, there's a reason, of course, why that is. And there are other upwardly professional type things that concern you, because if you move to a city to make $250,000 a year as a marketing executive or a software engineer, having 95 different Belgian ales to choose from, or a certain kind of truffled French fry appetite. I mean, these things would be useful. These things would be really important to you, which isn't so much wrong in and of itself, except that it becomes the thing with which we center our pop understanding of a city when we actually do publish these lists and talk about cities and our city's dead, right?
Exactly. And so much reporting was done during this past year, during the pandemic, about the death of cities, about will cities ever come back, revealing the fissures that are evident when there are these once-in-a-century crises, economic, health, employment, etc. You just see really an explosion of these, can cities ever bounce back? But what, again, is being centered there? And what we find time and time again is that best cities lists are really just real estate speculation. This will come as probably no surprise to listeners of Citations Needed. We talk about real estate interests a lot, but it's not purely the real estate interests and the upwardly mobile constituency that they are playing to, but also how that then influences public policy. If you are deemed to be one of the most livable cities, that is going to influence the way that budgets are allocated, is going to influence the way that public policy is made, that municipalities operate. That's why these are more than just sort of puff pieces that real estate speculators enjoy, but they actually have real implications. Now, these types of stories in the media are nothing new, and not nothing new in terms of, yes, we've been seeing them for decades, but the newspaper and magazine tradition of ranking the quote-unquote best cities to live in dates back over 100 years. One of the earliest references to a city characterized as quote-unquote most livable can be found in a 1907 real estate ad that ran in multiple San Francisco papers. Here's an example. Under Berkeley, California, real estate. It asks, why not Berkeley? And the article says this, quote, at the present moment, thousands of people are looking toward Berkeley as a place of future residence. Its fame is just beginning to spread as the cleanest, prettiest, most livable city of homes in California. There is every indication that Berkeley's present population of 40,000 will be doubled within a very few years. Are you thinking of adding yourself and your family to Berkeley's fast-growing population? The Mason McDuffie Company wants to help you get acquainted with Berkeley. It has maps and booklets which are yours for the asking. It has a very large and very choice list of property, which it is anxious to show you, whether you buy or not. Now, since then, since 1907, classifications of livability have almost uniformly been used in relation to business interests, whether to boost the real estate industry, attract companies, or lure people, that is, usually white people, in pursuit of prosperity. So, for instance, a January 28, 1911 article in the Topeka State Journal from Topeka, Kansas, said this under the headline, Topeka's Latest Edition. Quote, Topeka certainly appreciates the decision of the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad Company to make it the headquarters for the general departments that will have control over the operation and management of the 2nd District of this great railroad system. It is to be hoped that the feelings of Topeka towards these Rock Island newcomers will be reciprocated. In all modesty, it may be said that they are coming to one of the most livable little cities in the Great West. Media kept doing this year after year. By 1925, in the Fort Worth Record-Telegram from Fort Worth, Texas, you saw this, an article that summarizes ways for Fort Worth to grow as an industrial hub, and that touts its potential for its cotton and railroad development, not exactly industries from which everyone benefits, of course. Yet, the article also presents Fort Worth as a place where, quote, young America can thrive. And it says this, again, from 1925. Quote, young America wants opportunity, a chance for personal prosperity, independence, wealth. The land from Fort Worth to the New Mexican border is the greatest potential wealth producer in the United States and is rapidly swinging into production. It offers to the ambitious and energetic a share in these riches which in the older sections of the country are claimed, staked out, appropriated. That is the principal reason why West Texas, and particularly its capital, Fort Worth, is a good place to live in.
And in 1933, this idea of livability became very vogue as a place without crime. Again, exclusively white. This is about the preservation and the maintenance of whiteness. It just is. It will, as you will see, continue to be. From July 30th, 1933, the Dayton Daily News of Dayton, Ohio, quote, Commerce Secretary is in favor of developing civic center for livable cities. When William B. Warner, president of the McCall Corporation, established its large printing plant in Dayton, he was asked why he selected the city above all others for the home of big business enterprise, and he replied by saying, because Dayton is the most livable city in America.
Now, as we kind of enter the mid-20th century, no historical analysis of city reporting would be complete without, of course, a mention of Robert Moses, architect of the mid-20th century urban renewal projects in New York City. Now, to this day, Moses is often lauded for his public works, the parks, zoos, swimming pools, highways, buildings, and mass transit networks. As New York City's Parks and also City Planning Commissioner, Moses built 658 playgrounds, 416 miles of parkways, and 13 bridges. But his most enduring legacy was one of gentrification, the explicit destruction of Black, Jewish, Latino neighborhoods, and cementing an urban policy that gave priority to white, moneyed residents. After World War II, Robert Moses shepherded a vast amount of infrastructural development, including, most infamously, the construction of highways through and out of New York City. Moses' work escalated after the passage of the Housing Act of 1949, the provisions of which included federal funding for what it termed, quote-unquote, slum clearance, a process of demolishing low-income, often black and brown neighborhoods to replace them with higher-income, almost exclusively white ones, and the construction of public housing as part of an effort to render the poor invisible. For instance, here's a headline from a 1950 article in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle about the potential of one of Robert Moses' ongoing projects. This is from January 6th, 1950. The headline is, Tunnel to Raise Borough Property Values, says Moses. Many slum areas will become desirable when Tube is opened, and it's an article literally written by Robert Moses, credited as the chairman of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority.
As famed Moses biographer Robert Caro wrote for The New Yorker in 1974, the same year his biography, The Power Broker of Robert Moses, came out, he wrote, quote, to build his highways, Moses threw out of their homes tens of thousands of people. He tore out the hearts of a score of neighborhoods, communities, the size of small cities themselves, communities that had been friendly places to live, vital parts of the city which made New York home to its people. He would go on to write, to make room for the Coliseum, Lincoln Center, and the United Nations for a score of mammoth urban renewal projects, he threw out of their homes many thousands of poor people, and he used the urban renewal money available for housing to build housing for rich people, so the poor had no place to go except for the slums or borderline areas that would become slums. He built parks and playgrounds with a lavish hand, but they were parks and playgrounds for the rich and comfortable. Recreational facilities for the poor he doled out like a miser. When he built housing for the poor people, he built housing that was bleak, sterile, and cheap, expressive of condescension and contempt in every line. And he built in its places that contributed to the ghettoization of the city, dividing up by color and income. Now, at the time, the New York Times praised this effort because, again, who would not want to make a city more livable? Who would not want to make a city cleaner, get rid of the slums, right? It sort of sounds good because you think, oh, they're getting rid of slums and they're going to move them to some housing project. That sort of sounds sterile. Like, okay, you're getting rid of this thing that looks bad and then you're going to give them some nice shiny building. But of course, what you're doing is you're clearing land for real estate developers. So the New York Times editorial in 1954 scolded the city for not doing this fast enough, writing in their editorial, "Making New York livable. The house-to-house, block-to-block inspection drive to clean up the tenement conditions in 4 city areas as a trial run for even broader attack is overdue, but nonetheless welcome. Inspectors from 6 city departments, housing, sanitation, fire, water, health, and air pollution are taking part of this attack directed by Mayor Wagner, and Chief Magistrate Murtaugh is ready and waiting to deal out justice and punishment where warranted for landlords summoned because of violations already discovered in fabulous number." So again, they're protecting the poor man here, right? Going after the evil landlords, which sounds good, but not really what their goal was. It would go on. "This sort of thing is no good for it to be a 7-day wonder. It is no good unless there is persistent follow-up. The deterioration, the overcrowding have been in the years in the making. To turn back the tide of property and human degradation that make a slum requires more than 1 day display of police power and waving of an official badge. It requires consistent revisitation and concentrated pressure until an area is convinced that there is no escape from harassment in the public interest until unwholesome conditions are corrected." So this was something sort of broadly considered good because, again, people think of the projects now as this kind of ghettoization of Black America within cities. But in many ways, it was presented as a liberal project. It was presented as like, oh, we're going to take them out of these horrible conditions and put them in these public buildings. But as
they're being exploited by landlords, so the city's going to help them out.
They destroyed communities. And again, this gets back to the initial question of the episode, albeit somewhat college dorm room. What is a city? What makes a community? What makes a specific place have some through line of constituent parts that makes it something that's ontologically defined separate from something else? And I think that when you say, oh, we're going to eradicate the slums because they're a blight and they're bad, it sort of sounds good. But then again, what you're really doing is you're setting up an aesthetic for real estate developers and the wealthy, something we've seen repeated in various cities, obviously not unique to New York.
No, of course. I mean, but when you have the people who make a city, who build the city, who provide the city with its culture, with it, and I don't say that in terms of the way that real estate developers say culture, or style magazine writers, but like a city's look, feel, sound, when those people and their families, their entire communities are then relegated to the outskirts of those cities and their own communities completely razed, and they are put in housing projects, and that is what makes the city, quote unquote, more livable then. What are we actually talking about? And it gets to these kind of best cities lists. So the genre of the best cities list seems to really have originated the way we know it today back in the early 1980s. Now, one of the most famous early examples was the annual Places Rated Almanac, your guide to finding the best places to live in America, which was first published in 1981. Ronald Reagan's 1981. The Places Rated Almanac used 9 metrics to rank over 300 metropolitan areas, including housing costs, what it termed as crime, and personal economic outlook. Yet it inherently favored moneyed classes. For example, its data for housing only accounted for houses that were owned rather than, say, rented. Now, later came the advent of publications dedicated to, quote-unquote, urban life and other city-related verticals of mainstream national newspapers, continuing media's tradition of letting capital really dictate which qualities of a city are most desirable and thus most livable. Now, Money magazine, later subsumed under CNN, introduced its annual ranking of the, quote-unquote, best places to live in America in 1987. The magazine ranked, again, 300 metropolitan areas based on 3 factors they deemed most important. These were safety of property, personal safety, and the likelihood that houses will appreciate in value. Those were the 3 metrics. The 3 least important metrics were these: proximity to an Amtrak station, availability of household help, and closeness to a bus terminal. Now, the best city from Money Magazine's 300 metropolitan cities ranked, best places to live in America. The best city on the list was Nashua, New Hampshire, primarily because of, quote, the area's strong economy, first-rate schools, and proximity to both Boston and the bountiful recreation spots in New Hampshire's White Mountains, end quote. Now, of course, the White Mountains are not the only white thing in New Hampshire. In 1990, for instance, the census year closest to the publication of this Money Magazine list, Nashua, New Hampshire, was noted as 95.2% white. The article, kind of couldn't be more obvious in the way that it presents this. This is from the initial article, again, from 1987. It says this, quote, Nashua is the 20th safest metropolitan area in the country, according to the U.S. Justice Department. Residents cheer the lack of crime. Nancy Daly says, I'll leave my pocketbook overnight in my unlocked car in the driveway and never think of anything happening. Technology companies, aided in large measure by President Reagan's defense buildup, now propel the local economy. Today, 40% of local jobs are in high tech. The region's job stability was further enhanced last year when Lockheed, the enormous defense contractor, bought Sanders Associates, the biggest employer in Nashua and the state.
And so this criteria obviously still exists with us today. One of the most popular, if not the most popular, is the most livable 50 cities, published by USA Today, co-published with Wall Street 24/7, that has, quote, the most livable, America's 50 best cities to live in, written by Samuel Stebbins, Evan Coman, and Michael B. Souter. Now, what's interesting about this list is that they all have something in common, which is they're white, suburban, or even semi-urban enclaves in cities that are overwhelmingly or even sometimes majority people of color. And so the number one city, according to them, this is one of the more recent lists published in 2017. The most livable city is Carmel, Indiana. They write, quote, population 90,533, median home value 315,200, poverty rate 3.9%, with at least a bachelor's degree, 69.7%. So they're not alone. Carmel, Indiana has been listed number one best place to live by Money Magazine in 2018, listed number one place to live by niche.com in 2017 and 2018. It's the number 16 best place to live by Money Magazine in 2017, the third best place by Money Magazine in 2014, and the number one best place to live by CNN Money Magazine 2012, and Arboriculture's highest award, the Golden Leaf Award for Best City. So Carmel is just to give you some context here, Carmel is a northern suburb of Indianapolis. And the racial demographics of Carmel are over 85% white and 2.7% African American, despite Indianapolis, the city with which it falls near, is 30% African American. And Carmel, Indiana has a huge history of racial discrimination, as a lot of white enclaves near urban minority heavy or minority majority cities do. The Indy Star wrote last year that Carmel, Indiana is, quote, a city that has never elected someone who is not white to serve as either mayor or on city council. Likewise, every department head is white. In the Carmel Clay School District, only 10 out of more than 1,000 teachers, or less than 1%, are black. All of the 65 administrators are white.
Ah, yes. The greatest place to live in the U.S.
For whom?
A utopia, Adam.
In Carmel, Indiana, Channel 8 Indianapolis, WishTV.com, their IA investigative team, did a pretty good report about racial discrimination of traffic stops and found that black motorists account for 23.1% of all traffic tickets, despite making up only 2.7% of the population. The tickets written per 1,000 residents for white residents was 52.8, and yet it was 363.8 per 1,000 black residents. So they had a frequency of being ticketed at over 6 to 1. So if you're African American driving in Carmel, you are 6 to 1 more likely to be pulled over and given a ticket.
That's what happens in the greatest place in the U.S., Adam.
Number 2 on their list is Centennial, Colorado, which was incorporated in 2000 and had written to its charter it couldn't have city taxes of more than 1%. Centennial, Colorado is a white enclave suburb of Denver, Colorado. Centennial, Colorado is 84.7% white and less than 5% Latino and 0.4% African American, whereas Denver is 53% white, 30% Latino, and over 10% African American. Number 3 on their list is Arvada, Colorado, which is almost 90% white, 1% African American, and 8% non-white Hispanic, whereas Denver, again, is 53% white, 30% Latino, and 10% Hispanic. Number 4 on the list of best cities is Johns Creek, Georgia, which is 9% African American, despite Atlanta, the city that it's closest to, the city that it is part of, being 54% African American. So again, you're seeing a trend here, which is what makes a city most livable, according to this criteria and several others, CNN Money Magazine, USA Today. What makes cities livable, for the most part, is high income levels, which of course correlates with racial disparities, low crime, which of course heavily punishes the poor, because crime is mostly a product of poverty. And more importantly, you want to have proximity to large airports. They put nightlife, restaurants, culture, opera, symphony, city centers. So what these cities offer that these poll makers, these listicle makers love, is you have the kind of proximity to the urban life, but you're still in this white, protected fortress America that has 90+%, 87% plus white populations.
They're just advertisements for the suburbs, or as what's sometimes known as the exurbs.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something you see in a lot of these lists, which is, again, sort of the mother's milk of real estate attracting people, which is like, we've talked about this before, but suburbs are in so many different ways, and we can do a longer episode on this, Nima, right? But suburbs are about the preservation, protection of, and the maintenance of whiteness as a political concept. And very much these lists reinforce that. Now, look, do I expect CNN Money to have a meaningful analysis of the racist bias of their criteria? I mean, yeah, it would be nice. God forbid, maybe if you had critical race theory, you could do this.
Sure.
But this is a sort of thing you see over and over again. We talk about, so like, what does it mean when we say best cities, most livable cities? Well, livable for whom? Livable for what demographic?
Well, right. And so that question is exactly what animates so many of these articles. It's not just the listicles, because there are also all of these kind of urban life publications or sections of larger magazines or newspapers. The year 1990 saw the founding of one such urban life publication called City Journal, which is an extremely right-wing New York-based magazine published by the also very, very right-wing Manhattan Institute.
Yeah, for those who don't know the Manhattan Institute, it houses Heather McDonald, who's probably the most prominent critic of the Black Lives Matter movement, popularized the Ferguson effect, literally wrote an article about defending racial profiling, said it actually helps black people. They are they're definitely the most visible pro-police, most right-wing think tank. Most of the anti-critical race theory stuff that you've seen lately is being pushed by fellows at the Manhattan Institute. They are very much they're a white nationalist institution. I think it's probably fair to say. I think it's not. They are very much the most cited and most quoted non-VDARE, non-Breitbart, right-wing, anti-Black Lives Matter movement. Very much into the what about black on black crime crowd.
Yeah, exactly. And so 30 years ago, the Manhattan Institute founded City Journal. This is, coming off of the 1970s, 1980s kind of crime-ridden New York scene. And Manhattan Institute called their new publication a magazine that was a, quote, intellectual and journalistic response to New York's downward spiral and to the illness of the American city generally, end quote. Now, the downward spiral and illness that is being referred to, according to City Journal editor Brian Anderson, was the, quote, out-of-control crime, the, quote, disorder, the, quote, gigantic welfare agencies, and the decline of education caused by none other than, you guessed it, teachers' unions. Now, almost presaging the spate of narratives about COVID-19 and the death of cities, Anderson said in 2010, 20 years after the founding of City Journal, this, quote, combine these four things: crime, disorder, a massive and costly municipal welfare state, and horrendous schools, and you can understand why people were fleeing cities when they could afford to, why Hollywood frequently depicted New York as a frightening and chaotic netherworld, and why futurists were predicting the death of the city in a globalized world of instantaneous communication, end quote. And so this idea of analyzing urban life in this way, with these kinds of metrics, we have seen expand. We also see media consistently run PR for cities looking to attract tech companies, which kind of goes hand in hand with the way that City Journal operates. This is like the way that they wish cities operated, right? Something really attractive to business that expands, quote unquote, high-paying jobs. And so you see endless examples of this. You have September 2015 in Bloomberg, quote, the unlikely cities that will power the U.S. economy. You see USA Today in November of 2018, the 25 most innovative cities in the U.S. share affinity for technology. You see this from Inc.com in December 2019. These 5 cities create the most tech jobs, according to a new study. Here's why you should move your company to one of them. That one, incidentally, has the subheadline, quote, despite high housing costs and clogged commutes, these cities attract the best talent. And then you have from January of this year, 2021, NBC Miami reporting on Miami's mayor working to bring more tech jobs to the city, and Wired magazine following up a couple weeks later, also January 2021, Miami's mayor woos techies. What does he need to succeed?
Yeah, and this obsession with tech and high tech and new jobs, I mean, yeah, that's good for a certain demographic, but it's basically good, most importantly, for real estate speculators who want people with high incomes to move in so they can raise prices. And of course, most of these are just, to a great deal, to the extent to which they are promoting white-only enclaves, they're very much promoting gentrification. They're saying, come to these places, you can get relatively cheap rent or buy relatively cheap housing in areas that have proximity to downtown or hip, have nightlife, all the sort of fun stuff you want. Which again, fair enough, whatever, but that's what this is. It's marketing to upwardly mobile professionals who have disposable income. What you never see is, what are the best cities for the poor? What is the best cities for those who work making $15 an hour? What are the best cities for people with disabilities? With one exception, USA News and World Report did have an article last year about the best cities for people with disabilities. So there are exceptions. But for the most part, people who aren't spending lots of money going out to restaurants and buying tickets to watch La Boheme at the opera are not really that important in these criteria. Many of them do so explicitly. The most important criteria, almost all these lists, and again, we are generalizing, there are some differences, but they mostly follow a general playbook. The most important thing they mention is crime, specifically property crime. They don't factor in things like labor abuses, wage theft, union busting, rights violations of low-wage workers. But property crime is always, always central to these lists. One thing they also consider is the number of people with bachelor's degree, which is a proximity for both wealth and institutional wealth in whiteness. The New York Times and niche.com, with their rankings that they've used a few times, along with other factors, one of the main things they used was residents aged 25 to 34, the proximity to coffee shops, bars, and restaurants, of course, the level of education of its residents, and the costs of living. Now, again, how many young people you have in your proximity to coffee shops is an important factor for a very specific demographic of people. Mm-hmm. Now we're beating the dead horse. You know the demographic of people is, it's largely white, upwardly mobile professionals.
Now, a more pandemic era version of the best cities article is the which cities are dead articles. Now, as the COVID-19 pandemic grew last year in 2020, the panic over what was going to happen to cities really crescendoed, with white owners of capital and potential owners of capital fleeing cities, and the attendant media speculation that big cities were thus dead. These kinds of articles really proliferated, with a disproportionate focus on the experiences of, again, upwardly mobile white professionals. So, for instance, you had The Guardian right at the beginning of really the pandemic in March of 2020 saying, cities after coronavirus, how COVID-19 could radically alter urban life. And Politico, July 2020, with The Death of the City, which argued that teleworking, not the coronavirus, is making urban living obsolete. You have The Hill in December 2020. Is this the end of cities in America? The following month, the BBC, January 2021, New York is not dead, but it is on life support. And in March of 2021, you had CNBC asking, are American cities already dead? And then in May of 2021, the New York Times saying, New York is dead. Long live New York. The headline, incidentally, was later changed to, what is the future of New York?
And this led to a series of counter articles by other navel-gazing media types. Foreign Affairs, May 2020, the pandemic does not spell the end for cities. Wall Street Journal, December 2020, will coronavirus be the death of cities? Not so fast. Bloomberg, February 2021, why we don't believe in the big city obituary. Fortune, March 2021, if you think COVID is the end of cities, you're wrong. And again, the primary constituent being focused on here was upwardly mobile professionals, as indicated by the casual way in which they talk about work being done mobily. So as the New York Times reported in May of 2020, roughly 5% of New York residents left the city between March 1st, 2020 and May 1st, 2020. The greatest New York City population drops in response to the pandemic were wealthy neighborhoods. Of the total population of parts of New York City where more than 25% of residents left, 68% were white, 55% made more than $100,000 per year, and 29% made more than $200,000 a year. So the only time we sort of get the panic when cities are dead is when there's rare instances because of a pandemic of white people leaving a city in mass. This is considered a city dying. Conversely, when populations of non-white people leave a cities in mass, there is no such reports that a city is dead. In 2016, Chicago's black population had decreased by 350,000 from its peak level of nearly 1.2 million in 1980, a nearly 30% decline. Yet nowhere you'll find in reading any reports that Chicago is dead or that Chicago is dying. To the extent you see stories about Chicago is dead or Chicago is dying, it is to lament gun violence, but has nothing to do with demographic shifts or people leaving. St. Louis, just the same. The number of black residents in St. Louis has fallen every year since 2010, yet St. Louis isn't considered dying because of this. And in fact, the magazine Curb called it a city with, quote, potential and promise, adding that while St. Louis is, quote, many of the issues facing other Midwestern cities, including a declining population and a history of segregation, but don't count the city out, it's poised to incubate new ideas and attract new businesses. So when the wanted populations, again, upperly professional, largely white, they leave, it's fucking meltdown time. We get 500 think pieces. Right. When the people who are not considered desirable, right, the poor, people of color, they leave, it's like, oh, this is an opportunity for bringing in new businesses, and it is an opportunity for growth. And you saw this a lot during Katrina, that once Katrina killed 8,000 people, overwhelmingly black people, this was sort of a silver lining for the city to kind of attract businesses and be more entrepreneurial. David Brooks says, he literally called it said there's a silver lining. This kind of rhetoric of like the wanted and unwanted people in a city, because if you can attract rich, upwardly mobile professionals, this increases the tax base, increases property values. But again, whose experience of the city matters.
Exactly. And so therefore, who makes a city livable has to do with whose lives in those cities matter the most. To discuss this more, we're going to be joined by Jawanza James Williams, Director of Organizing at Vocal New York, a statewide grassroots membership organization that builds power among low-income people directly impacted by HIV/AIDS, the drug war, mass incarceration, and homelessness. He'll join us in just a moment. Stay with us. We are joined now by Jawanza James Williams, Director of Organizing at Vocal New York. Jawanza, thank you so much for joining us today on Citations Needed.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
So in this episode, we've been critically examining at the top of the show the way that American media ranks, categorizes, and speculates as to the health of a quote-unquote city. It likely won't shock you to learn that, with rare exception, how a city is viewed, specifically in the outlets we covered, it is viewed from the perspective of a kind of upwardly mobile, I think it's fair to say largely white, urban professional, which is why discussing cities as a kind of atomic unit of value is interesting. I mean, it's literally Tale of Two Cities, right? This has been written about before. It's such an interesting choice that a lot of media outlets make, and I think it kind of shows where their priorities are, specifically where their advertisers' priorities are. And it's kind of simply taken for granted that kind of upwardly mobile, wealthy professionals are the relevant moral constituent when determining the comparative or absolute value of a city. I want to begin by talking about how we view quote-unquote cities in the media. Who is left out when we make these generalizations about cities from your experience? I don't want to put words in your mouth. That's what we found. Maybe you haven't found the same thing, but I want you to tell me when you see that, or you see this, or you see people talking in generalities about cities, who is left out of that conversation?
Yeah, I deeply appreciate this question because it helps decenter the upper class, white, propertied folks that people are generally talking about. One of the things that I think is critical for us to understand when we're thinking about the stories that we tell, the situations that we are describing, and the kind of city that we live in, and the kind of city that we imagine living in, that we understand that whiteness is central, that capital and the market is central. And so therefore, anybody that challenges the sort of centrality of whiteness, anyone that challenges the usefulness of a market system or the justification for it, those folks are left out of the conversation. As so much as it doesn't help sort of maintain the sort of stories that are told in general by the sort of dominant narrative set by the same parties that I'm naming. So in short, what I'm trying to say is that we're not talking about the vast majority of the people in the city. We're not talking about the vast majority of the people that are servicing the city. So for instance, I'm thinking about people that live in the outer boroughs, in particular in the Bronx, for instance. Like I lived in the Bronx for about 4 years. And, one of the things that struck me, and mind you, I should note that I'm originally from Beaumont, Texas, a smaller city on the East Coast
Yeah.
of Texas near the Gulf of Mexico, near Houston, 80 miles southeast of Houston. And when I first moved to the Bronx, I noticed that in the morning when it was time to go to work, that the vast majority of folks were stuffing themselves into the trains and going to Manhattan to work service jobs. And I felt like that most of the coverage I see, most of the stories that I hear about what it means to be in New York, sort of the central stories of New Yorkers, they aren't really talking about those folks. So I think that the average worker, the person that serves these rich folks in New York City, people that are living in the homeless shelters, there are 78,000 people living in shelters right now in New York City, the richest city in the country, the richest country in the world, and the richest point in human history. We're not talking about those folks. We're not talking about the thousands more that find themselves sleeping on the streets or, seeking shelter in subways. We're not talking about the 100,000 students that went to school from a shelter in 2019. That's 1 out of 10 students in New York City. So I think oftentimes the conversation is leaving out the most vulnerable people in the city. We're not talking about the people that are still dealing with the AIDS crisis. The dominant narrative sort of suggests, in most stories that we hear, that AIDS is over. But, in New York City being the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic, 100,000 people have died from AIDS-related complications in New York State since the onset of the epidemic in the States. And there's thousands more still living with HIV, and thousands more that are, at risk of contracting HIV that are not being talked about, like sort of invisibilized communities, I should say. And they became very visible to me whenever I moved here.
I want to follow this up by talking about this is obviously the perspective of the disenfranchised and dispossessed is just taken for granted to not really matter, especially even not just in the media, but in political coverage, political priorities of the police. The police sometimes take the mask off, and I want to read from a 2019 article about flooding the zone is what Mayor Lightfoot in Chicago called it, what the CPD called it, Chicago Police Department called it. The Chicago Sun-Times reported, quote, "If police saw large groups of young people intimidating shoppers or otherwise causing trouble, they would surround these groups, follow them, and sometimes steer them back to CTA stations." And one of the interesting things about this paragraph is that the central moral constituent is shopper, which is such an interesting, not citizen, not person, not human being, but shopper, right? Sort of someone who's spending money. Andrew Yang is running for mayor of New York, caught a lot of heat when a few weeks ago he said on the campaign trail, quote, "We all see these mentally ill people on our streets and subways, and you know who else sees them? Tourists, and they don't want to come back, and they tell their friends don't go to New York City." So here we have tourist. This is very, very common phrase.
Consumer, tourist.
Consumer, tourist is being the thing that we're supposed
ones.
Right. That's the really most important thing in a city. And I find these comments very revealing because it's your ability to be rich and to spend money is what elevates your value. And not only are those who are, for example, quote unquote, mentally ill, not valuable, but they're actually a blight. They're treated like litter. And you see this kind of language all the time. These are just sort of two examples. But I want you to talk about how we sort of don't even notice how we assume who matters when it comes to a city is very often, again, people's ability. These are all proxies for real estate interest. But even beyond that, people's ability to consume is what matters most.
Yeah, again, I think this is it speaks to the sort of centrality of the market, and that everyone is seen not as a human being, but as a consumer. So one's value is determined by their ability to purchase and to participate in that market. And I think it becomes central because so much of the powers that are at play, and by that I mean the capitalist class that are within our sort of democratic institutions and trying to control them for the sole purpose of maintaining their ability to produce capital, oftentimes at the expense of the vast majority of us. If we tell stories that decentralize the capitalist and center the vulnerable person, the person that is unable to participate in said market to the same degree, we threaten the continuity of that kind of system. So I think that there's a really massive story that we're really talking about here. We're sort of like on the edges of, and it's really about the influence of big money. It's about the influence of capitalism in every sector of our society. When I think about the media in particular, I think a lot about Sinclair Group. I think about so many of the media outlets that the vast majority of people in this country and in New York City are consuming, that these organizations are not exactly telling the sort of like definitive truth, but sort of telling a story from perspectives that sort of fit within a framework that we call today mainstream, but I would call violent and dangerous. I think a lot about Pix 11 News, which I watch pretty faithfully most mornings just to get a sense of what the vast majority of New Yorkers are watching, what kind of stories and what kind of frameworks of reality they're being offered. And oftentimes those frameworks of reality are centered on, sort of politics of fear. They're centered on this mythologized characters, these archetypes that live in our public consciousness, like the drug user, the Black person, the poor person, the homeless person, and then how we really address that in this very reductive sort of like, we need police to be able to come in and keep us all safe. But the reality is that the police are being used and have always been used, and I would argue come from a foundation of being used as a means of protecting property. And I think that so much of what we're experiencing, the institutions in our society, what's fully funded, what's underfunded, ultimately aligns with the sort of maintenance of this domination, the sort of maintenance of this consistent or through line, this story that some people are lesser valuable than other people. And the police are the sort of physical, the material means of enforcing those problematic ideologies.
Yeah, the other night I actually made the mistake of leaving local news on when it came on, and Channel 4 New York, NBC News. It's basically just a police blotter. I mean, it always has been, of course, right? But I sometimes, even though this is literally my job, sometimes just forget how egregious local news is, like TV news. News at 11, it's all this person got attacked. This car ran into this group of people. This crime happened. This person was killed. And everything just results in clearly pushing the idea that more police are needed and that this city, New York City, is unsafe. And I think that we are seeing that kind of narrative also spread across the country in terms of the waning safety of cities, and also as it relates to what we've seen in the past year during the pandemic of all these reports about the death of cities, right, Joanza? So it's like the idea of centering, as we've been saying, the needs of urban white professionals, as Adam said, like the relevant moral constituent in deciding what makes a city either alive, dying, or dead. And in this pandemic time, we really saw how when pricier restaurants couldn't stay open, when a certain type of nightlife was shut down, when green spaces that were proximate to wealthy neighborhoods were either inaccessible or less accessible, weren't deemed as accessible because people were worried about going outside, being around other people. And of course, the quote unquote strength of the housing market and seeing the weaknesses then they are evident during the pandemic, those are all key factors in what is deemed to be the health or, livability of a city with that one singular constituency. And so the media pushing all this has mayors across the country saying that they're working to move up on these kind of yuppie-centered rankings and rating systems. Those are the metrics that they have to achieve. Strong housing markets, green spaces that are close to certain communities. You, in your experience as, an activist and an organizer for years, how do you think these media perceptions of the health, the livingness, or, as we've seen, death of cities really doesn't just shape, but perhaps really warps priorities of then the actual officials in those cities who make and present policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the critical issues with, local governments and state governments in particular, because if one of the things I often argue as an organizer, again, really anti-poverty, thinking a lot about the most vulnerable people, so much of the conversation, so much of the discussion always starts with like, well, how do we stabilize and expand the middle class? And as a working class person, I think a lot about, I understand the sort of intention, but the ultimate consequence is that if we focus at the sort of like midpoint, at the middle class, then we don't actually solve the kinds of issues that creates the most of the problems in our society for most people in the society. We should be centering the most vulnerable people, the people that are catching the most hell. So like, what would it look like if the mayoral candidates and the city council candidates, et cetera, whomever, the governor, instead of talking so much about homeowners, focus primarily on people in shelters. Like, well, what got them in the shelter? Why are they in the shelter? Why are they still in the shelter? And how do we get everybody rapidly rehoused from shelter? It would set a totally different perspective for everybody about how we should be organizing our city and state budgets, for instance. But again, I think there's so much of this is so intimately connected to market forces. I think a lot about real estate. I think a lot about just the people, the organizations, the special interests that have a vested interest, namely money, to create this sort of stories, this sort of narratives, this sort of ideal city, sort of like in people's imagination, and then using these sort of measures or these measurements or these factors to make people want to live in these places, while simultaneously creating the conditions that force people to think that something's wrong with the place. So like if we're saying live in Bed-Stuy or live in New York City because it's so, nice and there's all these nice things to do, and then now we're going to drive up all the cost of everything. And then it creates a homelessness crisis that rivals that of the Great Depression. And then the leadership doesn't actually address the actual root cause of the displacement, of the homelessness crisis, of the growing amount of poverty in the city, and then tries to sort of say that the city is dying because of like these other factors. And then I think it becomes a very convenient way to power oneself up. And I think we see Eric Adams doing that right now, who could very much likely win the mayoral election.
Yeah, because it's not as if politicians, of course, don't talk about homelessness per se. It's that when they talk about homelessness, it's always, with very rare exception, it's homelessness as an aesthetic nuisance
Right.
that needs to be dealt with. Now, there are various sort of more humanitarian ways they allegedly will deal with it, right? They'll say like, oh, we'll build housing.